Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode on the recent political developments in Bangladesh. Over the last couple of months, a lot has unfolded in Bangladesh. A dramatic chain of events led to the ouster of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who has ruled the country since 2009. Her fourth term, following her unopposed re-election in January this year, came to an end after major protests broke out as students demanded an abolition of quotas in civil service jobs. This quota reserved a third of the jobs for relatives of veterans from Bangladesh's War of Independence from Pakistan in 1971. This movement expanded, and clashes with security forces resulted in over 300 casualties. Despite the violence, the movement grew and forced the resignation of the Prime Minister. Since then, as things have slowly began to settle down, a new caretaker government headed by Muhammad Yunus has been formed, and students are now talking about the future of the revolution, how they plan to take it forward. To discuss these important themes, we are joined today by Dr. Sohela Nazneen, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. Dr. Nazneen, thank you for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me on this show.
I want to start the conversation by bringing in the context within which these protests emerge and the developments leading to Sheikh Hasina's ouster, as we saw, unfolded rather rapidly and since the protest started. So can you help us in understanding how did this issue trigger such a significant reaction, and what are some of the underlying or long-standing discontentments which led to the popular revolution?
Sure. The protests unfolded over the months of June and July. In June, the protest was mainly limited to public university campuses. As you sort of mentioned, that it was mainly around quotas, so 30% of the posts in first and second class government jobs being reserved for freedom fighters or their descendants. This was actually scrapped in 2018, but a writ petition in the High Court brought it back. And the students were protesting against that. The Students Against Anti-Discrimination, so the anti-discrimination movement that you mentioned, actually emerged from this platform, which is a loose platform sort of coordinated in different public universities. And also later on, private universities, students who joined the movement itself. The movement initially was very peaceful. There were mainly sit-ins and blockades on campuses. Then what happened was the Prime Minister made a very flippant remark, sort of mentioning the protesters as implying that they were grandchildren of the Razakars. So Razakars are the collaborators during the Liberation War, which is a very derogatory comment, which sort of elicit a lot of furious reactions from the students. The students were also attacked by the student cadres of the ruling Awami League. The residences were closed. So once the public university students got beaten up, the protest spread to private universities. It's important to keep in mind that there's a high level of youth unemployment. The quotas, the 30% that we are talking about, are seen as these are used to favor those who support Awami League. And the issue of corruption and accountability carries a lot of weight in Bangladesh, given the way the 15 years of rule has unfolded. Awami League is accused of cronyism, massive, widespread corruption, and there has been a lack of accountability and repression. So once the protests spread and the security forces came down really hard, particularly the police and the border guards, on the students, and students were indiscriminately shot at, that led to basically other sections of the society joining the movement. So we saw the artists, we saw the lawyers, we saw the working class people joining the movement, partly because of the brutality and the way the protesters were repressed. By the end of July, about 200 people were dead. By the time Sheikh Hasina fled the country, about the death toll stood at 580, and it's still going up. So that gives you an idea of how many people died from the repression that we have seen. Once the demands moved towards justice and accountability, the government tried to reframe, saying that the attacks were carried out by miscreants, third parties, extremists, but people were not buying it. The movement resonated because it was about justice, it was about fairness, it was about dignity. And it quickly shifted towards resignation of Sheikh Hasina because she was responsible for what was happening in the country itself. But the movement also resonated partly because it wasn't led by a political party. We have seen political parties in power. In Bangladesh, it's either the Awami League or the BNP that has won elections and led the government after transition to democracy in 1991. And none of them have done a stellar job, in the sense that both of them have undermined democracy, and people really don't trust political parties to deliver. And the movement was led by a non-political force. That's why it also had an appeal. It appealed to people in terms of giving people hope that there may be change. And people just did not want to live under the kind of repression that we have seen.
Thank you for that very comprehensive background of the events. And I think you highlighted within a lot of these points, a very interesting point to me, that was that it kind of resonated with people more because conventional political actors or forces did not exactly lead the movement. Which kind of brings me to my next question, which was that another recent development was the formation of the interim government with Muhammad Yunus as its chief advisor. So can you describe as to what led to his becoming the chief advisor, and perhaps you can comment on the composition of the government?
Sure. So the interim government is led by Dr. Muhammad Yunus, who is the founder of the Grameen Bank. That is the bank for the poor, as it's known. And he's also the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. He is very well respected and has a lot of legitimacy among the people because of his work on reducing poverty. But it's also about who would be acceptable across the different segments of the society in and of itself. So his name was suggested by the student coordinators of the anti-discrimination movement. It was discussed among those that were consulted by the army, because after Sheikh Hasina fled, army was in touch with the different political groups, but also different civil society actors and the student coordinators, and he was seen as the acceptable chief advisor. So that sort of led to him being asked, and we are fortunate that he has agreed to lead the nation. The composition of the the interim government is very interesting in the sense that it has both the old and the young. So it has career diplomats and technocrats. So, for example, Saeeduddin Ahmed who is looking after the finance ministry, was the central bank governor. You also have sort of others who have had a career in civil service, but you also have civil society leaders like Rizwana Hassan or Farida Akhtar, who have led NGOs and have headed organizations. You have academics like Asif Nuzrul, who have taught at public universities. You have had human rights lawyers, but you also have two student coordinators within who have been asked to join the interim government to represent their views. And also you have the leader of Hafizat-e-Islam, that's an Islamic civil society platform. So my understanding is that in forming this interim government, there was wide consultation in terms of representation from different groups of society, and most of them do not have links to any political parties, even though they may support particular political views.
Now, this new government faces a new set of challenges, and an issue which has emerged is that of law and order. And we have seen violence against those associated with the Awami League, as well as violence against religious minorities. And and we saw the immediate reactions to all of this on social media as well. How have these things progressed in the last weeks, and how is the new government responding to these issues?
Yes, it has been very unfortunate that we have seen violence against specific groups, but also opportunistic looting. So attacks on state property, but also attacks on police stations because the police were heavily used to repress the protesters, but attacks against Army League owned property and also Army League supporters and leaders and also religious minorities and their property. We have also seen reaction from the community groups and also students in terms of protecting state property and also minority groups. But it's partly I mean, some would say that this is expected when a political transition happens, but violence also begets violence, right? So you do need actions to curb that. What we have seen is, apart from the reactions from the community at the community level, and I know like neighborhood watches have been formed. I know that students have done quite a lot. We are also seeing attempts to bring the police back to work. About 539 police stations are functional now. We have seen the military providing security at police stations, but that is not a sustainable move in the sense that you would need the police to take over. The military has other duties to perform. We have also seen an attempt to create a independent police commission and changes within the top level of the police office personnel to ensure that you do need that shuffle because the force had been politicized and they're trying to address different concerns. So hopefully things would be functional and operating soon. The emergency services initially were overwhelmed, but they have started to respond. With respect to religious minorities, we have seen Dr. Yunus visit the Dhakeshwari temple. We have also seen sort of meeting with the civil society groups represented by the religious minorities present their demands. They have also held protests, and the government has promised to investigate into the matters and punish those who are responsible. So hopefully things come down and be moved forward, and that we are able to curb violence and maintain law and order, because that is the first order of priority.
Absolutely. So I want to understand that there was some degree of a distrust that can be said between, let's say, the citizens and the state in Bangladesh, which was characterized by rigged elections and disappearance of dissidents and authoritarian control. But now, as you mentioned, you have a revolution and a non-conventional political forces kind of leading it. So how do you see the political climate changing, and how do you see the state working towards bridging that distrust between citizens and the state?
Yeah, there were high levels of distrust, and it is not going to be easy to mend. But this is the first time, I think, in 15 years, people are hopeful. Um, I personally wouldn't have been talking to you the way I've been talking uh, openly if
Mm.
this interview was done in April, let's say, of this year. So that is certainly a big change. People are finally free to say what they think, but there's also high level of anxiety. We mentioned the issue about law and order, but it's also about how do you reform and what kinds of reform. So reform is at the front and foremost of the agenda that's for the interim government. And it's not just holding free and fair elections. It is about how do you reform the institutions in such a way that then they cannot be undermined and reforms are reversed, which is what we have seen in previous political transitions, both in 1991, but also when we had an interim military government in 2007 and 8, and it tried reform, and then what happened to those reform. So people have learned a lesson, right, in that sense, and they want something different. Now, delivering this something different is going to be a challenge for the interim government. And there are particular areas, and I'm going to talk about those particular areas, but also talk about expectations and how do you manage that. So the first area that people are hoping that would be addressed apart from law and order is the issue of justice, right? Because you cannot have a culture of impunity, which is what we had. Now, the issue of justice, we know that the government has asked the UN to form a fact-finding mission and to come and help, which is actually a good move because there is a lack of trust in the police and the judiciary. So having a third party would help in that regard. But you also mentioned disappearance and extrajudicial killing. We still have 100 people missing among those who have disappeared. We need to know where they are. We also need justice for the extrajudicial killing that happened. So it's not going to be easy doing this, but that kind of investigation, how do we do this, what kind of procedures, all of that need to be discussed, and all of that needs to be consensus-based and transparent. There is also the issue about how do you do institutional reform. We have seen personal change at the top level. So, for example, the governance of central bank, we know there is a high level of default loans and there has been mismanagement in the macroeconomy. So you do need to ensure transparent economic governance. But there's also changes at the high levels in terms of the judiciary, in terms of the police force, but it's more than personal change. It's sort of how do you reform the institutions in a way that their autonomy is not undermined, which is what we have seen before. So people have been talking about different things. They have talked about term limits. They have talked about basically proportional representation in the parliament, but they have also talked about how do you strengthen the anti-corruption commission, the ombudsperson, the accountability measures and procedures that exist within the different systems of the state. How do you engage people? And those take time to take hold, right? And you also have to be within the constitution to make those changes. So it's a tall order in terms of building trust. There are also other pressures on the government in terms of ensuring economic stability because there will be inflationary pressures. Bangladesh has started paying back the loans that we have on foreign sort of loans that we have taken, which is a good sign. Our stock market has picked up, but there are other bits that need to be addressed, and it's not going to be easy. And there are expectations that people have in terms of reduction of inflationary pressure because people are really feeling the pinch. And then there's pressure on the interim government that political parties want elections held within 6 months, or they have said they'll give time, but they do want it held. So it's navigating a complex scenario. The student movement itself, the anti-discrimination movements have said that they will act as a pressure group and they're keeping an eye on things. So the order is tall, right? And it's about people being patient. And that's a slightly worrying because sometimes people want quick changes. So it's about giving the interim government time to do what it needs to do. So far, the signs are good, but the patience needs to hold. The other thing to remember is that the interim government may have to take some unpopular decisions. So, for example, in terms of stabilizing the economy, or for example, in terms of reform of the different institutions, it's not always going to be popular decisions, what is wanted. And it's about whether we have built up that democratic tolerance, because democracy is about practice. It's not just about votes, or it's not just about what you want. It's about deliberation, and whether we have built up that tolerance to deliberate will be our key test.
I think that was a really important answer, and it really highlighted also the tall order of challenges for the new government, but also how the kind of cooperation that the state and citizens will need to have and maintain to see long-term benefits out of this process. And the fact that we're having a candid conversation about these issues perhaps indicates to the fact that the process of bridging has started already. But thank you so much again for joining us for this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will find it very interesting as well.
Well, thank you for having me. I've seen Bangladesh through different changes, right? And every time we have hope,
Mm-hmm.
hopes have been dashed in one way or the other. So this time I'm hoping it will be different. It's a different generation who has brought this forward,
Mm-hmm.
and they have been very savvy in the way they have built the movement, and the diffused leadership style that they had is certainly admirable. So hopefully the adults of Bangladesh are able to deliver and work. And yeah, and hopefully we see a new beginning.
Yes, absolutely. All our hopes towards that. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.